I am so excited because today we are talking about Avowed, and I have Ryan Warden, the I wrote oversees everything as your title. Production director. Yeah, literally. Production director, Dylan Harrison, senior sound designer, and of course, Venus Theory composer. Thanks everybody for joining me. We're talking about music. It's very exciting because I feel like music and sound design are a component of the video game world that unfortunately doesn't always get to be able to be brought to the surface, and we are continually trying to do that. So thanks for hanging out, and thanks to Xbox for doing this totally randomly for me. So that's awesome. Thanks for being here. Obviously, this is an undertaking of various degrees and various lifts and stuff. But like for you, what's it like to sort of be in this, the Pillars of Eternity universe that has been a part of, it's going on years now at this point. What's it like to create music for this and also create sound for this? Is there a certain degree of, well, I don't know if there's pressure because each project is individual, but is there a certain, a little bit of an emotional zhuzh that you feel kind of doing it?
I had the pleasure of working on Pillars of Eternity 2.
Nice.
I did some sound design for that. That was like 2018, I think. And I worked on some of its DLCs. It's a lot of fun to come back and revisit that world, but through such a different lens. Because, Pillars 1 and 2 are the isometric, old school, Baldur's Gate, style of game, the CRPG. Whereas now in Avowed, you can't really have much more of a different take on the game. It's so much different. I think we, at least on the sound side, we worked really hard to respect and pay an homage to the sound that was in Pillars 1 and 2, but then also kind of update it and modernize it and make it be more compatible with the style of game that we have with Avowed. So yeah, that was a lot of what we did. But I mean, there is certainly, we tried to take a lot of influence from what does Audra sound like in Pillars 2? What does magic sound like in the Pillars universe? It does have a very specific whooshy design element to so much of it. And so we tried to incorporate that, and tuck it in all the various little corners of the game's audio and just make it sound as cool as we could while still sounding like it belongs in the universe of Aora.
That's such a good segue for what we were trying to do with the music as well, is along with that shift in perspective from sort of the isometric view to more of a first-person point of view, take that recognizable spirit of Pillars of Eternity and the world of Aora and make it recognizable to the Pillars fan base, but also give it a fresh coat of paint, so to speak, to really make it not generic fantasy, but still recognizably fantasy.
That's actually a crazy point, that I didn't really think about, because when you think of the camera, in some ways a player can feel sort of removed from the action, whereas the music also has to dictate that sort of upfrontness that you're experiencing, where that's so interesting. I never even thought about that. It's such a good point. Yeah.
It was a big reference point for me as someone who had never played Pillars of Eternity at all.
Right.
I knew of the franchise, but that was one of the first things I put down in my notes, was that this is an entirely new perspective and the music has to reflect that. On, the emotional end, seeing the score from Justin Bell, who's a composer I respect to pieces, I was terrified to work on this game because I'm not really a fantasy composer. So to go up against someone who is not just an expert, but the expert on this sound, and knowing what that franchise means to people. That was my first day, was just Googling Pillars of Eternity, and there are podcasts, there are a whole subreddits, there are a whole fan wikis, and deep lore. And I knew that if I get this wrong, everyone is going to eat me alive. So, whatever I do, not being Justin Bell and not being diet Justin Bell, it had to be a case of whatever I do has to justify its existence in the game, and it has to be warranted in that it respects not only what fans love about this franchise, but what makes this game in particular different. So it was trying to marry the ideas of a composer who works in a completely different style than I normally do, but bringing it in a way to where it pulls, kind of as Dylan said, from the originals, but gives you something new and really brings it into kind of a new light, as Ryan said, with kind of a fresh coat of paint and a little bit of self-indulgence now and again. But, it happens.
That's a really interesting point too, because I was an opera singer for a decade, and one of the inherent pressures that one deals with is the fact that you're constantly being compared to other more talented people. Not that Justin's more talented than you, but from my case,
it's okay.
no, I was saying from my perspective, like, because I'm not Pavarotti, so like having to try to like craft something that is within the sort of lexicon already, but also like recognizing that it's going to be different, and one has to accept that there are differences and individual strengths and all that other stuff. It can be challenging to sort of like fiddle with the chops and find the path that works best for you. I mean, so how did you approach and Dylan, I'll do my best to also talk about sound, but then I'm also nerding out here about music, so I'll try to find the balance. But how do you like balance that, I think, for yourself, Venus Theory, so that you're like, okay, I know what's happening here, and I know what the sound was like, but then how do I take like, one main theme and create a new main theme within that structure, but not have it be, a one-to-one, so to speak.
We actually didn't really use a ton of Pillars themes in Avowed. There's only, I think, maybe 2 very clear nods to Pillars themes. And I think I lucked out there because, as a composer, everybody's a little bit different in just your own expression and actualization of your ideas and like the harmonies you use and the, tendencies you have. So as someone who comes from a much more abstract end of music, very experimental sound designy stuff and very, very ambient-y things and stuff like that, it was kind of taking the ideas that, what is the fantasy game tropes, an orchestra, and it's usually a Western style orchestra where we have, a string section, a wind section, a brass section, and the harmonic elements that those consist of. And I think I got very lucky on this gig in that when we established something like the title song, it comes in and it's very, recognizable fantasy, but it's pulling in some new stuff right away. And I think that subverts the expectation right away of like, this is not, I'm trying to be Justin Bell, but I'm not, this is a new thing, but it's in the same wheelhouse. But from there, I was given, thankfully, a pretty carte blanche license to explore, my ends of things. So by later steps in the game, we get away from traditional Western orchestral ensembles where we have like an Armenian duduk taking over as the lead instrument. And instead of the strings being used as you would in Western composition, I'm using a lot of like Indian classical music where it's based on like ragas and different ascending and descending scales and sub-child scales and things like that, and bringing in Chinese drum ensembles against like Greek instruments, and trying to, again, justify the existence of the music by referencing what I felt was the culture and mood dictated by each scene. Because for me, music is a heavily, heavily visual process. I don't know if you're familiar with like synesthesia at all, where like you see stuff when you make music. And I think that was my advantage here. Avowed is such a beautiful game and has such distinctive art that was looking at that and looking at the characters and their motivations and the story and the locations and trying to figure out, if I was a musician in this world, what would it sound like? And I think maybe Paradise is a great example of like a place with so much culture that I was thinking, I live outside of Nashville, so there's a lot of people busking there. And I was thinking about that of like, if there were people busking in this city, like what would they be playing? We live in an area where there's like a lot of wood and trees, so they're probably playing like string instruments or like wood built instruments and trying to pull that in. And I think that gave us a good basis to work from of like, these are things that we do a lot in fantasy games, but because we're in such a different perspective and different vibe from Pillars, we don't have to play that game. We can just kind of lean into the expectations, but also utilize that to subvert the expectations to give you something really unique.
So it wasn't a straitjacket, which is actually nice because you actually ended up getting a lot of freedom, which is cool. I mean,
if I could hop in for
please
1
do.
second, to just sort of like reinforce something that VT said at one point, like we're also, to give a quick shout out to our like area designers and artists. They do a really, really good job at like making each area be really nice and visually distinct from one another. And it's like, when you load into the city of Thirdborn in our game, it's not like you have to sit down and have some overly intellectualized process. It's kind of like it's screaming at you like what it should sound like, like you just look at it and it's like, okay, like I understand the idea. I understand the concept because our artists have done such a good job kind of like laying the foundation of what this area represents and like the people that live here and all that kind of stuff.
Except for Shatterscarp, which was a nightmare, but
it ended up sounding really really cool, and that's kind of forgive me, Marco, if you want to go on to another question, let me know.
No, we're just vibing, yeah.
A little bit, and kind of going back to that sort of, not to put words in your mouth, Marco, but that sort of like imposter syndrome, where you're like, yo, I am not Pavarotti, sort of thing. and then going over to Shatterscarp and trying to say, like, how do we make music that sounds like the desert but different? I think the two topics can kind of combine there, because one of the reasons why I sought you out specifically, Cameron, is because you marry that sense of cinematic beauty with the most delicious undercurrent of tension. And that's exactly what I was looking for in Avowed, is like, I'm the kind of guy who likes a little bit of salt with his sugar. So I want that little undercurrent of tension to actually support and lift up the beauty of the piece. And that's really hard to do, to sort of thread that needle where it's not too much tension and it's not too little, but they both combine to be greater than the sum of their parts. And I think Shatterscarp is a really good example of just bringing your personal style to it. It was an easy piece, probably the hardest piece to write in the game. And so it's a desert area. And so the idea is, how do you do desert differently? Like, I think you were able to bring your voice to bear on that and create a piece of desert music that feels fresh and new, but also grounded within the world. And that's super, super
it came together nicely, because I think when you're writing, as a composer, there are a lot of, like, again, expectations that you can lean into or you can leverage. Like, right. We know what desert biome sounds like. So if you walk in there expecting that and we do something else, then it does really stand out. And I think that song came together really nice for that. But we had a very long conversation about it, and I was like, the problem with desert music is there are two options. There's Disney's Arabian Nights, and then there's like Yellowstone but different. And neither of those works here. Because if we walk in and there's like banjo and cowboy chords, it's like okay, that's a little odd. And then if it's like Arabian Nights thing, it's like, well, like duh, like anyone. It was that was the hard part, is like, how do we find something that isn't an easy answer, but is a natural answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, as Dylan mentioned with the art team or whatever, once I kind of zoomed out and just walked around in that region for a bit, I was like, oh, okay, I think I get it here. And then I think I sent you maybe one sketch.
Yep.
And then it was like, boom, done.
Yep.
Obviously, we've been talking a lot about visuals, and sort of my perspective on things is always from an emotional basis, because my job was to interpret the music of others and then bring it so that an audience could understand it, and then they could interpret what they feel. And then, so my job was sort of the vessel of the composer's ideology and desired outcome emotionally. So how much for both of you, all three of you, sorry, how much does emotion come into play when composing, when sound designing? I mean, these are things that people don't necessarily think about, but emotion, it's funny because sometimes I get ragged on my channel because they're like, well, it's not technical enough. Well, it's like, well, actually there's a lot that we can deduce from an emotional perspective in so much of composition, and sound is about that sort of gut reaction, and people may not even know how to verbalize or articulate that. So I'm curious for both of you, and all three of you, excuse me, how that kind of plays into how you create and design.
I'd be interested to hear Dylan on this. This is an interesting question for sound design.
So, I mean, this is actually, it's at the very foundation of why I do what I do, I think.
Really? That's awesome.
I think that, so sound, both music and sound, which music is sound is not always music, but they both always fall under the same thing, which is that they're going into your ear holes. And they both, but I would argue especially sound, is a very subconscious medium. It's something that we were talking, for Marco's viewers, we were talking very briefly before we started recording, just kind of on this, about sound design has an unfortunate byproduct of its design where if people don't say anything about it, then that means you've done a good job. Like that means that people were they just took it for what it is. They were immersed. it was believable. What you did was believable. To go back to what I said at the beginning, which is emotion is at the foundation of everything that I do. I think that sound design is one of the most effective disciplines in game development at subconsciously telling you how you're supposed to feel in any given moment. And I strongly stand by that. I really do believe that. It's kind of like music at times, for example. It can like hit you over the head and say, this is how you're supposed to feel. Like if there's a cut scene or like if you're watching a movie and there's a really sad scene and you have the Yo-Yo Ma cello come in and it's just like, oh my God, this is the saddest thing I've ever, But I like to, this is a little bit of an anecdote, so stick with me. There's a movie called Mother. I forget who it was directed by, but it was the composer for it was a brilliant composer. His name was Johan Johansson, and he wrote an entire score for the movie. Worked with the director. I mean, it's like, this is like a 1.5 2 years project. Wrote this score. Literally at the very last minute, they're mixing the film and all this, and Johan Johansson goes to the director and says, I think we should pull the music out of this movie. I think it shouldn't have music. Honestly, it's a better film without it. Your sound designers did such a good job maintaining the emotional impact of this film that I think music is too heavy-handed. It's doing too much, and it's ultimately taking away from the end result. And sure enough, they gutted all the music out of that movie. If you go watch it, you'll notice it has no music. Insane. And but Johan Johansson is still credited as the composer of the film, even though it has no music. I think that is just a big testament to how emotional and how fundamentally audio can impact the viewer's opinion of something. Even if they don't realize it, it is because there is 100% of the time there's audio going into your ears while you're playing a game.
Yeah.
So it's really powerful in what it can accomplish.
I mean, people say whatever they want to say about John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, but there is a reason why that piece is like, because sound is everywhere. And, whether or not it's an air conditioner or the refrigerator or the toilet flushing in the apartment over, like, that stuff's all legitimate. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
There was this really cool little nook in one part of the game, in one of the first parts of the game in Dawnshore, where it was this sort of like stone ruins piece. And it's not like a grand point of interest. It's not anything that's going to be flagged on your map or anything. It's just like an outcropping of stones. And it always felt really weird to go there in game for the longest time. And then I was talking to one of our other sound designers. His name is Schwa, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm getting ready to put the ambience on that particular outcropping." And I was like, "That's what it is. It's completely silent there, whereas like stone has its own noise, and that's not something that I think your average person walks around thinking about. There is a latent noise to everything, even if it's just like an abandoned outcropping of stones." Yeah. It has a sound. And when he put that on there, I was like, yes, okay, cool. It actually comes together now because it sounds like what stone should sound like.
And I'll try to be quick here, but if I could, I'm not going to go deep into the technical aspect of it because this would be a lot longer of an episode if I did. But we got the opportunity to work with this really, really cool technology called Project Acoustics on this project. And the very long story short, it is the technology responsible for like if you clap in like a small wooden room versus clapping in a really big like stone room, like the reverb and the delay and like how that is spatialized around the player, like what does it sound like? So it's this very advanced kind of like, I don't want to use the word state of the art, but it's a very like new technique in the video game development sphere for handling that. And it does a really, really, really good job at it. I spent a lot of time tuning how Project Acoustics works and sounds in our game. And what that does is it localizes the player really well. And again, that immediately gives you emotional impact. Like if you're in town and you hear somebody blacksmithing far away, I know it doesn't sound like emotional right off the bat, but the thing is that it places you there
Right.
and gives you this feeling of like, oh, I'm in this city. I'm actually in it. I'm not just playing a game, watching some pixels on my screen go by. It helps like legitimately transport the player to a place.
It's really interesting. Oh, and then how do you add the emotional context to like the music then? And is that a priority when writing? Are you like, oh, I want to feel this way when I am walking, or like what's the sort of impetus there emotionally? Is there one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all gut reaction. Like I think most of the time I would play the thing and I would very deliberately save it to be played like once. And I would just go through that, play that whole segment, and with my notebook, like write down, what am I doing? What did I see? What stood out to me? Who did I talk to? What did they want? What did we do? Who did I fight? Is there anything else that's interesting here? And as a very avid or degenerate gamer, depending on how you want to look at it, like I just love video games a lot.
Yeah.
And I really love games like Avowed, and like Obsidian's one of my favorite studios. So I was like so hyped to even get the opportunity.
I can only imagine. Yeah,
an Obsidian like fantasy game thing.
Yeah,
like, okay,
yeah,
go.
1,000,000%.
So being a very avid gamer for like my entire life, like video games was all I had to do where I grew up. Like there was nothing else there. Other than like cornfields, which not super interesting after a while. You do one corn maze, you've done them all.
You don't like to shuck?
I did corn detasseling. I did it a lot. Yeah, it was a great time. But yeah, when I play games like that, I know what it made me feel. And I think now, being a mature adult with adult responsibilities and stuff, it became like, how do I translate that feeling of being like a 12-year-old playing Oblivion for the first time,
right? And
seeing like these huge cities and like these strange characters and these stories and all that. So I was very deliberate about like experiencing things pretty linearly. We did kind of move a little bit in terms of like the progression of the game, just due to like milestones we were hitting. But
of course,
I think something like Dawn Shore is a classic example of that, where the first time, and it's the first region of the game, you get off the boat, you see the docks, you walk through kind of a little dock area, and you walk out and just see this huge landscape, big, beautiful city, the mountain and the lighthouse and stuff. So immediately, being like the gamer lizard brain in me was like, go to the lighthouse, go to the lighthouse, go to the lighthouse.
Of course.
But go to the lighthouse, and thanks to the environment artist, I can climb the lighthouse. And my brain's like, go to the top, go to the top, go to the top, go to the top. So I get up there and just soak it in for a minute. And I was like, damn. And then immediately like shut the game down, open things up, and I'm just like noodling purely off that. It's very much not a technical process for me. And I think that's different from a lot of traditional composers, but also like a lot of composers I know don't play the games, which is, I get it to some degree. Because I don't think it affects their work. Like a lot of the composers I know that don't play the games, like they make insane songs. But for me, it's like I have to know all these things, because being very much a minimalist in a lot of aspects, I believe anything that's there has to justify its existence. And yeah, it was just like getting that feeling down was huge. And I think almost every time, if memory serves, I would do a sketch of just like a mood piece. And it was usually like a minute, 2 minutes,
not bad.
give or take. And I would throw it over to Ryan and say like, here you go. And I would get like some screen capture footage, because I think it's important to see it.
Yeah.
And I think almost every time the first idea worked, where it was like, yep, that's the direction, or like, yes, but ... of like, remember that like later you're going to run into this, so we have to include a little bit of this, that, and the other. But I mean, emotion is incredibly important. But as Dylan said, and as I'm sure you know, Marco, with the music, and if I'm just like minor because it's sad, that's really dumb.
It's disingenuous, yeah.
Right. So it became a question of like, and I think that's why I started leaning into like Indian and classical music theory of like, but framed through a Western lens, insofar as that like, okay, I'm starting in an ascending movement that's very major, and then we're going to go a little more ambiguous, where I'm going to remove like the color tones, like the 6, the 3, the 7, and I'm going to run up like a sus thing, and then I'm going to come down very minor, and then end a little more ambiguous and things like that. I think it was Berto who came up with the idea of and I think helping me to execute the idea I had of like, you shouldn't hear that all the time. Because as Dylan mentioned, it would be really heavy-handed to be like, Dawn Shore, da, 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 the whole time. And as a gamer, that would drive me insane.
Yeah.
So we had this whole system put together of like, when you're just kind of hanging out and not doing much, the music isn't really there. There's just kind of some subtle mood things
Oh, thank
going on,
God.
coming
That's
from
so
like
nice.
ambient experimental music, totally my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And then we ended up designing it to where when you do hear these bigger moments, it's extremely intentional. And that was the feeling thing of like, when I got to the top of the lighthouse, that's when I hear that in my head.
Yeah, right.
So that's where that's going to play. But when you're just kind of hanging out and wandering around, we're going to, chill things out a bit because we want, as Dylan said, it has to be transparent. And I think, and maybe that's a weird opinion on the music, but I feel like the best game scores just feel like that's what you're supposed to hear right there. Because otherwise it's just a little loop. And I think
They're not like shaking you by the collar. Saying,
Yeah,
I am-
exactly.
right.
Exactly.
And I think that was a really cool experiment. And I think we pulled it off well, considering that we didn't use almost any live recording. Like there was a lot of very experimental like stuff I did in this score. And I think that allowed us to utilize the restrictions we faced of not utilizing like a huge orchestra and putting it together in a way to where we could create a dynamic music system that fits the fantasy adjacent music framework we wanted. So that, because composing a dynamic orchestral score would be a nightmare. And especially the sessions we would have to record, like it would. I don't think it would have been possible to do what we did if we had to do it with.
we would have had to do something completely.
Oh man, it would have been a nightmare. I probably would have left and cried. But yeah, I think emotion's a huge part of it because it's a necessary thing, but you can't be too obvious with it. Like I said, it has to be kind of like the Shatterscarp example. It has to feel like the right answer.
Yeah.
It can't be the obvious one.
So that's a really interesting point because I was going to ask like the balance between ambient and melodic music because there is that dance of the two and one showcases the landscape and the other dictates the character's emotions and so on and so forth. So I mean you basically answer that question and for you Ryan, like so as the sort of oversee, I mean like how do you balance that for yourself, like in terms of balancing the technicality and balancing the human aspects of that? I know we don't have too much time, so I know that's a complicated question, but
Yeah. I'll take a stab at that and let me know if I'm diverting. I think one of the things that I tried to prioritize out of every single day is how do I unblock the team? If there's a group of people that need something from me, whatever that is, in order to continue with their work and move forward, try to knock that out of the park really quickly. Even if it's something that I just absolutely love doing, like working on the soundtrack and trying to come up with, okay, so how do we make this sound like Avowed? And I'm just a knuckle dragger producer, man. So I didn't have a whole lot to offer there other than how do I unblock this as quickly as possible so that talented, creative people can apply their skills.
yeah, totally.
I don't know if that's 100% what you were asking, but
It was. No, yeah, you nailed it. And I guess for all three of you, like what is something that you want someone to listen to or listen for? Like what is something that you want someone to be able to like pull away from this when they play this game? Whether it be emotion, a sound, a particular sound, like what is the one thing you hope that someone takes away from the sound and music experience of this game?
What I'm most proud of on this project is so like there's the very obvious sounds, which is like you're in combat, you're swinging swords, you're hitting things, you're casting spells. That's kind of the stuff that like is the equivalent of emotionally banging you over the head, where it's like, yeah, it's cool, it sounds cool, and there are a lot of very cool combat sounds in our game. Like I think we did a lot of really good work on making combat and everything sound visceral and believable, and also just make it more fun. But I think what I'm most proud of and what I want players to like try and actively listen for is the ambience. As well as that Project Acoustics thing I was mentioning. Like, I think that at any given moment, you can stand still in our game and just listen, just take in the ambient audio, and you'll find something that'll crop up every now and then. Every 15, 20, 30 seconds, something will crop up that, again, it emotionally anchors you into that place, wherever you happen to be at that moment. It brings you back and makes it feel like, oh, I actually am in a little farm stable. Cool. Like, yeah, I mean, I hear it. I hear what they're talking about. That's what I would like encourage players to seek out is, try and actively go listen to some ambience in the game, because I think you'll be surprised by how much detail and how much attention we really put into it across the whole game.
Awesome.
Yeah, on the music end, just to lightning around it, kind of to your point, Mark, with the idea of ambient music versus like the big music. One of the interesting things to point out is they're actually the same. It's all the same song. It's just written like 5 different ways to seamlessly blend. Musically, though, I think the biggest thing for me was like the idea that Avowed, as like a meta of the story, is not a hero's journey. It's more of like a hero's mystery. And I think that really comes across in the soundtrack. And I would really encourage people to listen to how over the course of the game the soundtrack evolves to reflect everything that's happening. There's some fun kind of hidden nods within the title theme I think people will pick up on later. And I guess ultimately the on-voice theme I think is the thing that's really cool, because when you're doing character themes, when we think of like Darth Vader or something, it's like it's the Darth Vader thing, or Jaws, it's the Jaws thing. And I like that, but also it's hard to do a character theme for a game that is so built around the idea of choice. And I think the most fascinating concept within the music end was not the idea of choices and what happens next, but the idea of consequence as something that's really, really important in playing into the idea of consequence being the leading element rather than the result of an action. And that reflects a lot in the on-voice theme, which you'll hear throughout the game. And it's not actually the same theme every time. If you play through it and make different choices, it's your on-voice theme. It actually evolves to reflect the thing that you have done and the implications of that and the consequence of that. And I think that turned out really cool. And there's, just so many like micro iterations on things that I think work really well. So I'll be curious to hear people pick up on that, because if you play it again and make different choices, it's musically a totally different story.
That's the interesting use of leitmotif. I wish we could talk about that for like another
hour.
Oh,
yeah. I know.
Hey, Ryan, how about you?
I hope that, and I think that we accomplished this with the score. I hope that players feel like Aora is a giant world. I hope that they feel that the world is bigger than any one character, even if it's the main character who plays a pretty important and integral role in that world. And I think we did it.
Well, the Living Lands as a whole has its own theme, and it's actually in like every song. But it's not like a motif at all. It's more of just like a textural thing that's imbued everywhere.
Yeah. It's pretty neat. Awesome. I can't wait for people to hear it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to the three of you for being a part of this and having this conversation. I think that music and sound is something that's often, I mentioned this at the beginning of this, is often overlooked, and it's always a pleasure when we can, get the people that do it and have us all together and talking about the value that sound and music really brings to game experiences. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for hanging out with me for half hour and talking about this.
Heck yeah.
Thanks.
Of course.
It's fun.
And thanks everybody for watching. Definitely check out Avowed when it comes out, and we'll see you later. Bye everybody. Take care.